Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to this conversation with Lara Freidenfelds, who's here to talk about her new book, The Myth of the Perfect Pregnancy, A History of Miscarriage in America. It's great that you're here. I want to start by thanking you for joining us. My name's Dorothea. I'm one of the owners of Labyrinth Books. And I also want to give a shout out and a thank you to the Princeton Public Library, our co-sponsor for this and so many other events, both in normal times and now here online. You can follow either the library, the Princeton Public Library, or Labyrinth Books, or both of us on Crowdcast, on our Crowdcast sites, on our Facebook sites, or you can sign up for our respective newsletters on our websites. And then you'll get an email. Each of us sends out an email with our programming, our respective and our joint programming once a week. So you'll get updates like that. I also wanted to give a shout out, but I wasn't able to find in my email the right information. I had help also getting word out through the connections of a filmmaker who's made a film on miscarriage that was shown at the Princeton Public Library. And I couldn't find in my email the name of that film and the information. But if you are on this now, I invite you, the filmmaker, to please put that information in the chat. Oh, here it comes. Good. Don't talk about the baby. And it's Krista Gervon. So please, Krista, if you would put the information about that movie and its distribution in the chat, I think this might be of interest to a bunch of people who are with us here tonight. One other thing I'd like you to invite you to put on your calendars is an event the library and Labyrinth are doing together on June 17th. We'll be hearing from authors Rebecca Jordan-Young and Katrina Karkazis, who wrote a book called Testosterone, an unauthorized biography. So I thought some of you here might be interested in that as well. Just a couple more housekeeping things. The Myth of the Perfect Pregnancy, here it is, beautiful book, is available from us at Labyrinth. The information is in the chat. You'll get it 10% off, and it ships for free if you order it by sending an email to info@labyrinthbooks.com or by calling us. All that information is also on our website. You can always place an order online, but for that 10% off and free shipping, please send an email or give us a call. And you can also do curbside pickup that way if you want. A little bit more to say on practical terms. I will be turning the chat box, the chat function off in a little bit when we start our conversation. But there's another way on this platform for you all to ask questions, and we invite those questions. We want those questions. There's a Ask a Question button in the middle of your screen at the bottom. And you can just put questions in the queue right there. And you can also, if there's already a question there that interests you as well, there's a little arrow, you can upvote that. And then I can see when I look at the question that there's a bit of a cumulative interest, and make sure to get to those. So as this conversation goes, please feel encouraged to put your questions in the Ask a Question box. We hope to get to a lot of your questions. In a moment, I will introduce Lara, and she'll then speak and give an introduction to her book for folks who haven't read it yet for about 10 minutes. And after that, I will get to ask her some questions, and then it'll be all of your turn. So, Lara Freidenfelds is a historian of health, reproduction, and parenting. Her first book is The Modern Period, Menstruation in 20th Century America. It was awarded the Emily Toth Prize for Best Book in Women's Studies. And her research has been supported by many prestigious fellowships. And she has taught at Wellesley, at Berkeley, and at Harvard. Her research for this book is really impressively varied and comprehensive. A woman's pregnancy is accompanied, of course, not just by the range of her own emotions, but also by the familial, the political, the religious, and the economic forces that that guide our views of expecting mothers. And given all this, it's really shocking how little we hear or know about miscarriage, even though it's a very common occurrence. So this is now addressed and redressed by Lara's book, which takes us from colonial America to the present day through a variety of lenses: medical history, the history of constructions of our notions of motherhood, the history of various technologies, also of marketing to expectant mothers. All of this is woven into a very masterful narrative, and it's a narrative that's always grounded in the testimony of the experience of pregnant women or women who've lost their pregnancies, whether those are recorded in diaries from the Revolutionary era or on today's blogs. And so, Lara, maybe with this, I can ask you to begin by telling us a little bit about the genesis of this project, and maybe to give us a brief overview of the book, so for people who haven't had a chance to look at it. Does that sound good?
That's great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be with you all in the way that we can right now, and glad we at least have this.
Yes.
So the seed of this research was planted when I miscarried my first pregnancy, now 17 years ago, before I had my children. When it happened, I was shocked and sad. I was also a professional historian already. I had just finished a dissertation in women's history, and my coping mechanism was to turn to history for perspective. I knew that a couple of centuries ago, women and their doctors didn't think about pregnancy the way we do today. Much about life was a lot harder then, but an early pregnancy loss, like the one that I had in the first trimester, would have been easier, not so emotionally loaded. Given how common miscarriages are, so about 20% of confirmed pregnancies miscarry, I thought a lot of people might appreciate this historical perspective. I also wanted to understand how we got to our current culture, because I believe that if we understand the path to where we are today, we have a better chance of building a path we like better going forward. I decided that I would tell the story as actually a bunch of small histories. So each chapter sort of tells its own history. And this is because our culture, our medicine, our technology has changed in a myriad of ways that have each affected how we experience pregnancy, childbearing, and pregnancy loss. And the history that I tell in this book, I think it's a very hopeful history, actually. This is a story of how so many things that are really very good, that have reshaped our childbearing in very positive ways, have had this unfortunate side effect when it comes to early pregnancy loss. And I think if we understand how we got here, we can actually tweak what we're doing now to improve it without losing all the benefits of modern childbearing. So in the book, I start by looking a little bit at colonial America and reminding us that in colonial America, women had children pretty much as soon as they started getting married, and children came when they would come. And women and their doctors saw early pregnancy as an uncertain state of being, one that might or might not turn into a full-term pregnancy and a full-term birth. And if they had a loss early in pregnancy, they decided whether or not they thought of it as a child based on whether the contents of the miscarriage looked like a child and whether they had quickened or not, whether they had felt fetal movement or not, because that was popularly understood to be the moment of ensoulment of the child. And if they didn't see those markers of personhood, then they saw the miscarriage as either a late period or the contents of a pregnancy that had never really come together to be a child, which is obviously very different than how we experience it today. And there was a much broader difference, too, in women's lives under patriarchy, where childbearing meant a lot of different things than it does today. So in the book, I take this apart and say, how does each strand tell its own little story about how our childbearing has been reshaped? I look first at birth control. The idea, first of all, people had to have the idea that they could control their births, that they could change their fertility, and that this was a good idea. And that was something that started around the time of the American Revolution and ramped up right until the birth control pill came along in the 1960s. And today we count on this idea that we should control our fertility and that we have nearly perfect control over preventing pregnancies. But the side effect when it comes to miscarriage is that it can lead us to believe that we have perfect control over fertility, when really we don't. We're very good at preventing pregnancies, but not actually good at sustaining pregnancies that are destined to miscarry. Second, I look at the history of parenting. So in colonial America, people had children for all kinds of reasons that are less common reasons for having children today. People had children for economic support and to carry on the family line because they believed it was their God-given obligation. In the centuries since then, our reasons for childbearing have narrowed and narrowed until we focused almost exclusively on the bond that we want to have, the emotional, loving bond that we expect to have with our children. And that's a wonderful thing, but it has led to expectations around bonding earlier and earlier also, all the way into pregnancy and even early pregnancy, and meant that we expect to have a loving bond with pregnancies that may not become our children, and that's a very difficult thing. We have developed wonderful medical care for pregnancy. Prenatal care was an innovation of the early 20th century, and with it came the idea that if you took good care of yourself, you ought to be able to have a healthy pregnancy, a safe birth, and a healthy child. And it was great that doctors had the intention and nurses of supporting women in having healthier pregnancies. But from the get-go, there has been a little more assurance that we can control the circumstances of pregnancy to make them healthy and perfect than we really have, unfortunately. Prenatal care has also given us a whole genre of scientific illustration, that is these developmental timelines I think we're all familiar with, pictures of embryos and fetuses as they develop in the womb. And the narratives that come with them tell us that these are our children that are developing, and that these pictures represent what's actually happening inside our bodies. Unfortunately, while they are accurate representations of typical human development, they aren't really perfectly descriptive of every pregnancy. So if a pregnancy is destined to miscarry, it's not an accurate representation. And that's been a difficult piece of that development of the modern science. We've, especially in the 20th century, gained a tremendous amount of material wealth. And we've poured it into our family life and into how we care for our children in many ways that have been quite positive. But when it comes to pregnancy, the effect has been that marketers, knowing that expectant parents are very interested in new products, are changing their lifestyles, are making a lot of purchases, then they want to target those expectant parents. And they have ramped up being able to target them earlier and earlier in their pregnancies, and also been motivated to tell expectant parents that they should bond with and be excited about their pregnancies from the first moments. And that's been extremely difficult when those pregnancies then go on to miscarry. We also have some wonderful technologies that support the medical care that now really supports modern pregnancy. We have ultrasounds, and we have excellent blood-based and urine-based pregnancy testing that in the late 1970s became available over the counter as home pregnancy tests. But those technologies, the expectations we built around those technologies have had some difficult implications. So we've developed a whole ritual around ultrasound, and that ritual of meeting the baby and having a special moment before the birth when we could meet the baby developed around the mid-pregnancy ultrasound, around 18 to 20 weeks. But in recent decades has been something that expectant parents have started to experience with an earlier ultrasound around 8 weeks. But unfortunately, at 8 weeks, a lot of pregnancies are still destined to miscarry. And this ritual of meeting the baby has become, for a lot of people, a ritual of losing the baby. And that's a really difficult thing. And finally, home pregnancy tests have given us information, have really helped people feel like they're in control of their pregnancies and their decision-making around their pregnancies. But the difficulty there has been in how we read them. Instead of reading a positive home pregnancy test as evidence of an implanted embryo, which it is, with some chance of making it to a full-term birth, we tend to read a positive home pregnancy test as evidence of a baby inside who will emerge in 9 months. But the tests they now sell over the counter, you can buy a test that can tell you whether you're pregnant up to 6 days before you've even missed your period. And at that point, if you test positive for pregnancy, you actually only have about a 70% chance of going to term. There's a 30% chance of losing that pregnancy. So all of these cultural and technological developments have just been wonderful in many ways and really supported a very positive modern culture of childbearing. But they've come with these difficult side effects when we can't make them work perfectly. So what I'm hoping to share with people in this book is some views of how we might think about what happens when we can't make it perfect. And do we want to modify some of our rituals, some of our expectations, maybe some of our narratives around early pregnancy to make it easier to accept when we have a loss and be able to celebrate when a pregnancy comes to term and not have early losses be such a difficult burden as they currently are.
Yeah, I'm sort of toggling back. Lara, I think with that, you've given everybody a really nice sense of the way in which your book moves between this rich history going all the way back to colonial America, our contemporary culture, our contemporary moment, and then arrives at some very strong recommendations that I want our conversation also to get to. And throughout, you trace this dynamic that you've also now described of a sense of control as technology and medicine develops and culture changes, and then also the illusion of control. But I thought maybe we would start with another aspect that I was so impressed by in your book. The periods of the story, I think in broad strokes, are colonial times, then the Revolutionary era, Victorian America, the 20s, post-war 50s, countercultural 60s, 70s, the 90s, which were my own childbearing years, and this kind of dominance of the notion of perfection, and I related to a lot that you described there. And then our sort of broadly contemporary moment. And in all those phases, you are really good at showing how class plays a role at different stages in different ways in shaping the reality and the ideas about motherhood and about pregnancy and the loss of pregnancy. Could you talk about some examples of that, of how class inflects all of this?
Sure. So I would say that throughout, the American middle class, and particularly the urban and suburban middle class, have driven these changes because they've been the people who have the most resources in our culture and have been culturally dominant in a lot of ways. So it was middle-class urban women who first began to reduce their childbearing. And there's some evidence of it in letters around the time of the American Revolution. It's pretty subtle, but historian Susan Klepp has done a wonderful job of tracing this out. And I follow her in this scholarship, seeing how women started talking about, well, maybe after our sister has had 5 or 6, we'll have a chat about stopping the children coming. And we don't have the clearest sense. We know that people used a variety of what had been traditional ways of reducing childbearing, especially at times when a woman needed to take care of her health. So in colonial America, a woman might use emmenagogues meant to bring on the menstrual period, or she might convince her spouse that it was not a good time to have intercourse for a while, or breastfeed for a very long time, trying to stave off the next pregnancy. And this was understood to be a good strategy, especially if her health was vulnerable, if she was sickly or weak. And then around the time of the American Revolution, women and their husbands began to use these traditional techniques in new ways, began to imagine that actually you might decide 5 is enough, or how about we try to space them out so that we'll only have 5 or 6 by the time I'm 42 and my childbearing naturally ends. So it was middle-class women who began that cultural shift. And then that continued to be the case through the 19th century. That was who began to have many more abortions. And it seems to have been partly about resources, who can afford to make these kind of changes, partly about the lifestyles that middle-class people had an incentive to adopt, where they would spend more energy raising each child and educating them, spend more money on them. We're familiar with this scenario today, I think, the idea of investing a great deal in a small number of children. And that was a middle-class innovation of the 19th century, and one that we very much inherited. So, where I see class playing out somewhat today is that the pressures that middle-class women feel, which are plenty, on getting this all to be perfect, are even tougher on people who don't actually have the resources to do all of this in even attempt to be perfect. So, social class has been interesting and important throughout, and continues to be part of this dynamic of middle-class people pushing for as perfect as possible, and the pressures of those ideals then falling hardest, I think, on working class people.
Yeah. That theme of perfection, right? Of sort of cultivation of perfection, and all the ways in which that has happened over time and plays out today, is so strong and so strongly developed. You have a section in the book that you call sentimental science. I think what you described in your introductory remarks about the ultrasound rituals is an example of that. And I felt in reading that there's another strand that one might call moralizing technology, or something like that, a sense in which technology creates a set of expectations about the good mother and the good parent, and what it is to succeed and what it is to fail. So maybe you can revisit some of that for a little bit, and talk about how science and technology in the history of miscarriage especially shape emotions and shape morality.
Yeah. So throughout, certainly since the early 20th century, reformers who wanted to improve women's experiences of pregnancy and childbirth recruited science and technology to try to make this happen, but often in a way that was, like you said, quite moralizing, telling women that they needed to adopt modern medicine, medical care in the 1920s, and that in a way that might seem familiar to many of us today, telling women that they should monitor everything that they eat, how much they sleep. In the 1920s, you would have been told also to make sure that you wear the right clothing, that you don't sweat too much, that your pores are open, because that was actually believed to prevent preeclampsia. And actually now we know that that doesn't work. So a lot of what middle-class women especially were trying hard to do, and were telling everyone else that they really needed to do to take responsibility for protecting their pregnancies, was things that didn't actually work, but made people feel like they were taking control and trying to get more perfect outcomes. So, I think throughout the book, I try to show how it's not that I think that trying for good outcomes is a bad thing. Of course we want to try that, but since the 1920s and through today, I think that we've sort of hoped that personal responsibility would somehow create perfect outcomes and put pressure on women to do things that really can't create perfect outcomes. So, just as much as trying not to get too sweaty in 1920 did not prevent preeclampsia, avoiding sushi is only going to do so much when it comes to making you not have a miscarriage. In fact, very little. So I think that we've throughout been tempted to recruit. We want to use our medicine, our new knowledge. I mean, I think very optimistically, in a good way, very optimistically hoped that modern scientific and medical knowledge could help us make all of this safer and better. But we've taken it and put that responsibility on individuals in a way that actually has not always been scientifically supported, and has created a lot of pressure and stress and expectation. And then layered into this is often a rhetoric of, let me help you love your baby starting from conception so that you will be motivated to take care of it properly. And this was, and that was true starting in very early prenatal care advocacy. So we can see this in the 1920s. For example, these embryonic timelines. In the 19th century, doctors started to say, wow, look at the new embryonic knowledge. I'll show you this embryo. It's the size of a horsefly, and it looks like a worm folded over backwards. So it was amazing because humans were so animal-like as embryos, so unformed. But then by the 1920s, you can take the same picture, and the prenatal care advocate is saying, this may not look like your baby, this, the subtitle, but it is your baby, and it's developing fast right now, so you need to take good care of it. And that's a very different labeling of that same image. So we started showing people these images of embryos, but also instructing them how to think and feel about them. And that has informed our popular advice about pregnancy care ever since.
Yeah. So much in what you're saying is so amazingly developed in your book, and it links for me, especially what you're saying about the sort of burden of responsibility on the expectant mother. You develop that in another discourse outside of the sort of technological and medical health discourse, which is the psychological discourse, and in talking about attachment theories and the ways in which there's an arc that goes from theories about early infancy and mother bonding, and then that time, just as the notions of where does life begin, as we're able to see those images, goes earlier and earlier in the pregnancy. And we can talk about abortion debates, which you're also great at. But for now, also there's this shift to saying that there's an attachment that happens, or maybe needs to happen from the earliest moments of pregnancies. So talk about that and its effects in building this pressure and on the experience of miscarriages in particular.
So this is historically very interesting because the psychological literature on attachment began after World War II and was based on what people observed about children who had been taken from their parents to keep them safe from the war for years in, terrible, difficult situations, and children who had been in orphanages during wartime, and said, well, this is an attachment problem. So this means that mothers need to spend 24/7 with their children for the first several years of life. And it was a bit of a stretch to go from being orphaned is bad to being a mother needs to be with her children 24/7. But it was the leap people were inclined to make at that time in the 1950s, when people were very focused on home life. And then this idea of bonding actually came along in the 1970s. And some people may remember it if you had your children in the 1970s, this pressure to have this magic moment at birth when you bonded with the child. And that somehow if you missed that magic moment, you worried it would affect your relationship forever. Actually, the professional literature has mostly pushed back on these ideas about bonding and done a lot to try to reassure parents. If something, if you need a C-section, it's okay. It's really going to be fine. You're going to have a good relationship with your child. But our popular culture picked up this idea of bonding, and it was developed actually not so much by professional therapists as by regular people chatting about this on the internet. It just sounded right, and popular writers took it up and started talking about bonding as if it were something that happened from conception rather than from birth. And there are, to some degree, attachment parenting philosophies have actually then somewhat also taken that up and pushed it. But it wasn't really, actually a lot of professionals try to reassure people that bonding doesn't really happen as this magic moment. It's really a long-term process over the whole time from when you start imagining that you will have a family to, your children growing and growing up and leaving home eventually. It's really a lifetime process, not a magic moment. But that idea of these magic moments and how the earlier it is, somehow the more meaningful it is, has really struck a chord in popular culture and been taken up. And unfortunately, I think it's really been amplified by our current purveyors of pregnancy advice, which unfortunately are websites and apps, not sage physicians or psychologists or people with a broader perspective and your interests at heart. So that app or website would just as soon have you bond immediately, because the people they're selling the ads for would like to get you before their competitors do.
Right. So I was going to actually ask you about that, because I find that it's a history that's so much grounded, that yours is a history that's so much grounded in this present of websites and pregnancy apps and the predatory marketing, as you're saying, of commodities for mothers and babies, which are enabled by that technology. And I found some of the testimonials there just enraging to read, if maybe you can say a little bit more about this matrix of technology and the marketplace and how it can create unnecessary grief for women who lose a pregnancy. And then I want to get to your recommendations, and I want to ask some questions, because I want to be sure to leave time for those. But maybe now we can talk a little, because it seems like you really weave the contemporary moment through every chapter and give voice to women writing on these in these blogs and posting, logging as it's called.
Yeah. So throughout the research, I guess the whole point of the book was to understand this current moment and really understand what a contemporary pregnancy experience is like and why. So throughout doing the research, I tacked back and forth between the historical sources and the contemporary. And since it's been a long time in process, I've actually watched the contemporary develop. It's been 17 years, about 15 of that I was really, at least on and off, focused on researching the book.
Wow.
There weren't apps 15 years ago. There weren't even really websites much. It was easy to not do a website-oriented pregnancy. So in some ways, I've watched a modern history evolve and kept track of this historical evolution over recent time at the same time that I was looking over this evolution over a few hundred years. And what's really struck me is how much all the patterns I've talked about have become aggravated by pregnancy websites and apps. And I think especially the apps are just, if you stay quite involved with them, they'd like to be part of your life, like any app on your phone wants to be part of your life. Every minute would like to send you information, send you ads, and keep you engaged. So user engagement is the sort of the currency of apps. And that's how they sell you to their advertisers. And I think having our pregnancy advice coming through that kind of medium just creates, just magnifies the problem of having advertisers tell you to get excited about your pregnancy, offer you a million ways to get excited about your pregnancy from the first moments. And they're tempted to tell you it's all going to be fine. They're tempted not to give you good advice at the beginning. And frankly, now what I see is that they've at least figured out how to be nicer about it if you have a loss. It used to, 10 years ago, you'd be receiving those updates from the website. They might not ever figure it out. You might receive a happy first birthday for your child that you miscarried. And that was very difficult. Now they figured that part out, but it's almost become a closed system where they say, here is how you can mourn a pregnancy loss, and we'll be with you throughout. And we'll be with you through the process of trying again. And we will be with you, therefore, from the moment you conceive the next time. And I think that by creating that kind of closed system, they're kind of cutting off people who, from any skepticism they might feel, that I know that I felt, I was really misled, because I didn't actually understand the statistics till I started looking into it. And I looked into it because I had a miscarriage. Now that app will say, no need to look elsewhere. We have it all right here. We'll tell you how to handle it, and we'll tell you how to stay with us. So I fear that apps there's no natural check on them. They have an incentive to keep you emotionally involved in any way they can with your pregnancy, and therefore with their app. So I think these apps are really problematic, and I would love to see nonprofits figuring out how to create some, what I would call safe apps, or that give you the information you really need, but don't have an incentive to keep you constantly engaged.
Yeah. There's really no room for ambivalence in any of that culture, and you describe that. But maybe we can stay with some of your thoughts about what we can do. You're an historian first, right, and an advocate second. And while you are both in this book, you're very careful for most of it to subordinate the advocate to the historian until the conclusion, and that way the reader can think along. And we talked about this a little while ago earlier, also how important it is that there's really just a kind of a broad evidentiary basis that you develop, and but at the same time, I was very grateful that you then wrote as forcefully as you do in your conclusion. And there are a lot of things, it turns out, that we can do to change practices and to change a culture, and therefore the experience of pregnancy loss. And language and narrative matter here in your account. So maybe you can start with that and tell us how and why.
Yeah, so absolutely. To me, knowing the history gives you perspective. And once you have perspective, you can have an idea what you think might happen next and might make sense. And people may agree with my recommendations or may not, but I at least can give you many chapters of evidence to start. And then we can have a really good discussion from that about what we all think we could be doing better. Yeah. So to me, one example of something we could change, we historically created out of the birth control movement the idea of Planned Parenthood, which was a great idea. But, you know, when it comes to pregnancy and the potential for miscarriage, I'd like to see us maybe think in a little different metaphor, which would be prepared parenthood. We also actually, there is a history of a movement called prepared childbirth that was about, rather than planning your birth, which we all know, you know, they don't always go how you plan, you could at least be ready for whatever happened. And that kind of preparation gave you resilience. That we could think about being prepared for parenthood rather than planning our parenthood, to come to a time in our life when we know that we're open to having children, and we can be happy about that and celebrate that openness and know that we're ready, but that it might happen, you know, hey, sometimes it happens in 9 months, you're going to have the baby. And other times you'll try and it'll take a few months and you get pregnant, and then that pregnancy won't stick and you'll have to try again. And then that pregnancy might take a little while. And it could be 2 years later that you have your birth. And that would be well within a healthy woman's childbearing. That's even if there's no fertility issues at all. So recognizing that if we're prepared for that whole range of possibilities, we could maybe enjoy it a little bit more, maybe also have grounds to push back on employers and others who seem to expect that we can schedule this when that's not a realistic thing.
Yeah, yeah. All of those things. I mean, you also are, and we're going to move to your questions in just a minute, but you are also really talking here in some ways to the tech industry and to, you know, there are real changes that you want to see. So both in how we talk about and how we represent, but also, you know, what we demand of in the marketing arena, in the technology arena, and from medical practitioners, right?
Yeah. So I think, you know, it's interesting. So people like me who are feminists who work in women's studies and in the history of medicine are often actually extremely critical of doctors, but this happens to be one of those situations where, you know, I think getting doctors on board would be really helpful. And I think most physicians, midwives, you know, they know the statistics and they know them intimately. And they would like people to have that knowledge, but they're just often not in a position to give it. And I think part of it is making sure that we have those doctors' voices there to say something to women in a preconception visit that's more along the lines of, I just want you to know this may work out the first time, or the first time it may not stick and you may need to try again. And that's healthy and normal. There's nothing wrong with you if that's how it goes. That is normal childbearing for a healthy woman. And if we went into our pregnancies knowing all of that, I think we'd have more basis for being more reserved in how we engage with maybe the apps, a little more skeptical, a little more self-protective. I know I would have wanted to have been if I had understood that. And other people may want to make that same kind of choice. And if we could bring our healthcare workers on board and give them the script and some opportunities to say it, I think it would be really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. So I have other questions, but I'm going to I'm going to hold back and let's turn for a minute to some of the questions that are in the queue. And again, anyone who's listening, feel free to add to that. But there's a question here from Elaine asking if you could talk a bit more about how definitions of when life starts or when something counts as a baby have changed over time. And how that has affected conceptions of miscarriage. So your whole chapter on abortion comes into play here. And you do something there that I haven't seen very much, which is propose some sort of a middle ground. Maybe you can speak to that, these whole questions a little.
So, you know, this was something that I think I didn't know exactly what I thought about all of this actually before I did the research for the book. And my thinking was definitely part of the research process, thinking through this. And I guess where I've come to is that the traditional way of thinking about pregnancy had some real wisdom to it. So before people, before women and their doctors really understood modern embryology, the way that people thought about pregnancy was that the contribution from the man, the semen, combined with the menstrual fluid in the woman's womb and came together, if circumstances allowed, to form a baby. And when the body was formed, then the soul entered in. And if you had a loss and you saw the form of a child, or if you had felt the kicking, which was the quickening, which is how people understood the physical sign of that life entering in, of that ensoulment, then a miscarriage after that point meant that you had lost a child. And before that, I mean, in fact, most first trimester miscarriages, if you just have a natural miscarriage and you don't know what you're looking for, you'll see blood and maybe a little bit of tissue, but you don't see the form of a child. And there's something about actually taking the miscarriage quite literally that way that I think we've sort of lost and we might want to bring back. And so, as you described, I wrote a chapter about abortion. Partly because I wanted to say, look, the abortion debates, people often think they know how that affected things. And, they're not wrong, but there's more to it. So a lot of how the abortion debates affected all of this is that abortion was one of the first ways we had really public, widespread conversation about first trimester pregnancy. That just wasn't something people really talked about in public. And we did it through the abortion debates, which meant that every pregnancy, pregnancy was debated as something which either you had kept the pregnancy and then you had a baby, or you decided to abort the pregnancy and then you had decided to not have a baby. And miscarriages are just invisible in that debate. The way that we debate abortion, it can get very polarized. But in fact, when you look at polls about how people think about abortion, they're usually, a lot of people are somewhere in the middle. They think some abortions are okay and others are not, and that later is more of a problem than earlier. Well, maybe that later is more of a problem than earlier is a continuation in some ways of the wisdom of, colonial times and earlier ancient times. And maybe we should ask if that might be meaningfully inform at least how we experience miscarriages, whether or not we, whatever our abortion politics might be.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I see another question here that maybe toggles well with your descriptions of the rituals of the ultrasound ritual, but is about a different developing and more recent ritual. The question is, what are your feelings about gender reveal parties, and how has this trend become so commonplace so quickly?
Yeah, so I think part of there's various reasons that gender reveal parties are appealing to people. We love labeling by sex. In fact, it's not actually, in some ways we're building gender, social gender, out of revealing what we think is the biological sex of the child. And that's partly how we decide a whole bunch of consumer choices and name choices and the other kinds of choices that move us forward into the process of parenting. And I think that those are very appealing because they play into all these choices that are really, in some ways, modern parenting choices. And people are excited to do that because we've been bonding with our pregnancies maybe before we even missed a menstrual period. So by the time we know the sex of the baby, we are, raring to go and ready to start parenting. So I think that's part of the reason they're very popular. I guess most of the time they're happening late enough that it's not actually a high risk of miscarriage time in the pregnancy. Because, I guess it depends what different people are doing. If you have a gender reveal party too early, the sex might not have been identified correctly, and then you might regret that. Right. But I think, and I also think that there's been real desire to make rituals around pregnancy and to get going on this parenting timeline and to feel like the pregnancy itself is special. I don't want to say that that's overall a bad thing. In some ways, it's part of the fact that we have one or two or three, maybe children. The majority of Americans have one, two, or three, like the vast majority. So we don't do this very often. But part of this is maybe something we could ask ourselves. Do we want to hold our horses a little bit? And just ask, is this coming from me, or is this coming from outside pressure? I think anytime a marketer or a website or a writer says, well, what if you don't record this special moment in your child's life? Won't you feel bad about it? That you should say, wait a minute, And I know that part of this, and I've been working on this book so long, I've got one who's, I feel like he'll be at college any day, not quite, but soon.
Yeah.
But it's that there's a lot of special moments, that you get so many moments, which is awesome, that you don't need, in fact, every single one to have this really good parenting experience and this bonded, loving relationship with your child. So if that pressure is coming externally, it's always worth asking a question, whether you really mean to be engaging with this. Is this meaningful to you, or is this because there's a whole marketing machine meant to have this bonding and parenting happen at a very early stage?
Right. Yeah. So next question here is about a sort of generational shift related to C-sections. This is Terry, whose daughter, she sees in her daughter's generation the prevalence of C-section, and was at an earlier point herself a radiology technologist, and just has that experience of that not having been the norm in the same way at all. And the question is, whether this is something that is bottom up or top down. Is this the medical profession driving this, or is it coming from mothers who are worried? Is it part of an anxiety phenomenon? What's the origin?
I would say it's actually driven by the doctors and the hospitals. So there's some really good research. If you want to read more about this, Jackie Wolf's book called Cesarean Section, I forget, it was a history of something. But Jacqueline Wolf is a wonderful medical historian who wrote a whole book about this that's really good. But it's actually about the structure of modern medicine, of doctor pressure to do something. And sometimes that can come from women, but I think it more often happens that women, it's wrapped up in this, feel pressure to do all the things, do all the right things, do as many things as possible to make sure that everything comes out well. Doctors feel that same pressure. Doctors feel that they need to give you a perfect baby. And so do midwives, any practitioner. And, that's a really hard thing because, it's way different statistics by the time you're talking about birth than you're talking about early pregnancy. But not every birth comes out perfect either, no matter what they do. But we, as a culture, expect perfect births. And so doctors feel the pressure to do everything possible, which backfires. At this point, our C-section rate's about 30%, and it's pretty clear that we're doing more damage than good at the margin. So it's too bad that that's where it's gone. It is wrapped up in all of this culture, but I don't think it's coming from women, except to the degree that the culture creates anxiety. Doctors create anxiety. Hospitals like to get people through the doors, in and out. And all of that comes, it doesn't take much if a doctor shows up at the bedside and says, I'm worried about the baby. Yeah. There you go. And no woman is going to, few are going to have the strength to question that. So that's where the C-sections have come from. So it's a combination, but I don't think that it's somehow like that women are being perfectionists and demanding, actually. Right.
Yeah. So we have time for maybe one more question, and it goes back to what you mentioned briefly, having to do with the sensitivity of pregnancy tests. The question is whether you feel that the ability to know that you're pregnant even before you've missed your period, is that affecting how miscarriage is perceived, and how?
Yeah, it's creating a lot more miscarriages. So if you test at the first possible moment, you have a 30% chance of losing that pregnancy, just because week by week, pregnancy the ones that are not going to make it, largely because of chromosomal issues, fall away, miscarry. So, that sensitivity means that we're finding out earlier. It's pushing this timeline earlier, which means that you can get involved in getting excited and, engaging with apps and websites earlier. So I do think that sensitivity has definitely amped this up. And part of the issue here, it's not the test itself, right? We could have a test where, it said, how many weeks are you at? You filled it in, or you looked at the chart and you said, okay, I'm going to line it up at this many weeks. I have this positive, means I have an 80% chance of having a baby. That would be information that you might really want. And I don't want to take that away from people, but that would be a really different thing than what people feel like they have, which is, yay, I'm going to have a baby in 9 months. And I think that the test makers, hey, they could label it differently. We can ask for that too. And that might really be a helpful thing, is saying what that really is. What does that test really mean? And what does it mean at this moment in my pregnancy?
Right. Right. Yeah. There are a few more unanswered questions, but at the same time, I think you're addressing them indirectly, and by sort of saying how we can begin to talk differently and reframe the question of miscarriage. And for all the other questions, I just point you to the book itself, because it's so very rich, and I hope that all of you have a sense of that. Now, or a developing sense of that. I also want to mention that Lara has some resources for book groups on your website, right? Which is just her full name, larafreidenfelds.com. And she also mentioned to me that if you do want to read this book in a book group, which I recommend that you do, then she's available to interact with you through Zoom or email, answer questions. So that seems to me like a really great offer. Thank you for that on behalf of everyone, Lara. So we'll end maybe with another thank you to you, also to the Princeton Public Library, to all of you who tuned in. Do buy this important, beautifully written book from an independent bookstore that's near and dear to you. We all need your support in this time, especially, and details for ordering from Labyrinth are on our website. I can also bring the chat back up here, if I can see how to do that. There it is. And I put all that also into the chat at the top if you want to look there. And you can get 10% off and get free shipping. So with that, I wish all of you a good evening. Be well, and join us again for another event. Thank you so much, Lara.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Oh, one more thing, that there are more of you registered than could make it. The recording of this event is going to be available on Crowdcast for a few more days. But we also will post it to our YouTube channel, to the Labyrinth Books YouTube channel, and that's just Labyrinth Books Princeton. And I can send a link around to folks who haven't shown up, but feel free to revisit if you want to, and to share with friends.
And I'd like to just invite you, if you want to discuss this at all, contact me on my website. I'd love to hear your stories, your reflections, anything that you have to say about the book. I'll definitely be in touch.
Great. Thank you. Thank all of you. Take care, everybody. And until next time. Bye-bye.